Mafia boss threw the black girl into the street. Then she took revenge and ruined him. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, back to our main character. Jasmine Blackwell, a young woman with the world against her, had always kept her head low. Born into hardship, she'd learned early on how to survive in a world that seemed to look past her at every turn. Her job as a waitress in the heart of the city wasn't glamorous, but it was honest, and that's all she ever wanted. But on this particular day, things took a turn she never expected. Jasmine had always been aware of the power dynamics around her. People like Vince Malone, a man who owned the city's streets with his wealth and influence, would never even look her way unless it was to look down on her. That's how it had always been. He walked into the diner where she worked that morning with his usual air of superiority, surrounded by his bodyguards and the scent of expensive cologne. He was everything she wasn't: rich, powerful, and completely unbothered by the struggles of people like her. Jasmine went about her job, trying to ignore the way his presence made the entire room tense. But as fate would have it, a small accident was about to change everything. As Jasmine was carrying a tray of drinks toward the back of the diner, she bumped into Vince, spilling a drink all over his expensive suit. The room went silent. Every eye in the diner was on her, waiting for the fallout. Vince, of course, wasn't pleased. His eyes narrowed, and he looked at her with a mixture of anger and disgust. He could have let it go, but no, he couldn't let someone like her get away with disrespecting him. "Get out," he growled, his voice low and full of venom. Without another word, he grabbed her arm and shoved her toward the door. The cold air hit her face as she was unceremoniously thrown onto the street. Jasmine stood there for a moment, stunned, her heart racing, her pride shattered. But this wasn't the end. No, this was just the beginning. Jasmine wasn't the type to take things lying down, especially not when it came to someone like Vince Malone. She might not have had his money or connections, but she had something far more valuable: resilience, brains, and a burning desire for revenge. Over the next few days, Jasmine did what she had to do. She gathered information, used her connections, and dug into Vince's empire. What she uncovered was something no one could have anticipated. Vince, the man who thought he could control everyone, had a few dirty secrets of his own. Jasmine was ready to take him down, piece by piece. The first step was to outsmart him. She made sure to get close to those who could help her unravel his operations. Slowly but surely, the web of lies, corruption, and betrayal began to unravel around him. With every move she made, the walls around Vince's empire started to crumble. The Mafia boss, who had once looked at her like she was nothing, now found himself in a game he couldn't win. And when it all came crashing down, when his empire was exposed, Jasmine watched from the shadows, a quiet smile playing on her lips. She had done it. She had turned the tables. Vince Malone had lost everything, and all because he underestimated one thing: the power of a woman who refused to be silenced. Jasmine didn't sleep much that night. Her mind raced, turning over every moment of her encounter with Vince. It was a blur of anger, humiliation, and, oddly enough, clarity. She knew that she couldn't just let it go, not after everything he had put her through. But now, she had a plan that would ruin him in a way he could never have imagined. The streets of the city were quiet, the hum of traffic far off in the distance as Jasmine walked through the alley behind the diner where she worked. It was late, but she had a job to do. The old phone she had picked up earlier that day buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from one of her informants. She read it quickly. It was more than she had hoped for. Vincent Malone had been involved in something bigger than anyone realized. Jasmine smiled to herself. It wasn't just about getting revenge for being humiliated. No, this was about bringing down an empire built on fear and lies. Vince's empire. For the next few weeks, Jasmine kept a low profile, gathering information wherever she could. She visited places she'd never dared to go before, always careful to stay out of sight, always listening, always watching. Her life had changed. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was someone with a purpose, a mission. Every piece of information she gathered brought her one step closer to Vince's downfall. She learned that the Mafia boss had a deep web of connections, each one dirtier than the last. He'd made enemies, of course, but his biggest mistake was thinking he could control everyone. Jasmine knew his weakness. He was arrogant. He thought he could do whatever he wanted, without consequence. She'd seen it in his eyes the day he threw her out into the street. Jasmine didn't let her emotions cloud her judgment. She didn't want to make mistakes. Every move had to be calculated, every decision deliberate. There were nights when she couldn't sleep, her mind spinning with the possibilities, but she kept pushing forward. Vince didn't know what was coming for him. Then, one day, Jasmine got the break she needed. A source she had been working with, someone deep within Vince's network, sent her a files that could expose his entire operation. It was the moment she had been waiting for. She had the evidence. She had everything she needed to bring him down. But Jasmine didn't act immediately. No, she knew better than that. She had to wait for the right moment. She had to be patient. One wrong move, and it would all fall apart. The following week, Jasmine made her move. She had secured a meeting with one of Vince's old business associates, a man who was starting to see the cracks in the foundation of Vince's empire. The meeting was set for midnight, in an old warehouse on the edge of town. Jasmine was already there when the man arrived, a nervous look on his face as he stepped out of his car. He didn't know Jasmine's plan, but he knew he needed her. He handed her a briefcase, the file she had been waiting for. The man was scared, but Jasmine wasn't. She had the upper hand now. She smiled at him, a calm, confident smile. "You made the right choice," she said softly. "This is bigger than anything you can imagine. And you've just signed your own ticket out of Vince's world." The man nodded, his fear evident in his eyes. He knew what he was involved in, but he wasn't stupid. He'd had enough. Jasmine left the warehouse, the files safely tucked in her bag. She was so close now, so close to finishing what she had started. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Jasmine carefully orchestrated everything, every detail, making sure that when the time came, Vince wouldn't see it coming. She didn't just want to ruin him. She wanted him to realize just how far he had fallen. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice. Jasmine made her final move during one of Vince's high-profile meetings. She had already planted the evidence, files, recordings, everything that would expose him. As he sat at the head of the table, his smug expression barely hiding his sense of control, Jasmine pressed send. The truth spread like wildfire. Emails, news reports, phone calls, everything Vince had worked for started to unravel. His associates began to distance themselves, one by one. His empire, once so powerful, was falling apart. Jasmine watched from the shadows as the world she had worked so hard to expose came crashing down. Vince's face twisted with disbelief as he realized what was happening. His arrogance had finally caught up with him. The people who once feared him were now abandoning him. His empire was crumbling, piece by piece, and Jasmine had made it happen. The best part? Vince had no idea who had done it. He thought he was untouchable, but Jasmine had shown him that no one was above the truth. Jasmine stood in the doorway, watching as the once powerful Mafia boss was escorted out of the building, his face a mixture of anger and defeat. She felt a sense of satisfaction wash over her. But it wasn't over yet. Vince had one more thing to learn: the consequences of underestimating someone who refused to stay silent. Jasmine had done it. She had ruined him. Days passed, and the city continued its relentless rhythm. Jasmine could feel the weight of her actions settling in, but it wasn't the crushing weight of guilt, it was the satisfaction of seeing the pieces fall into place. Vince Malone, the man who thought he could control everything, had been brought to his knees, but Jasmine knew this was just the beginning. The fallout was spreading like wildfire. People who once feared Vince, who bowed to his every whim, were now speaking up, distancing themselves from him. The media had picked up the story, exposing his illicit activities, his dealings with corrupt officials, and his stranglehold over the city's underworld. It was exactly what Jasmine had wanted. His power was unraveling, and the world was finally seeing him for who he truly was. Yet, in the midst of this, Jasmine wasn't celebrating. The feeling she had now was one of quiet reflection, of understanding how fragile everything really was. She didn't want to become like Vince. She didn't want to let power corrupt her the way it had him. Jasmine had learned a long time ago that life could turn on a dime, that someone who had everything could lose it all in the blink of an eye. But even as the world turned against Vince, there was still one thing Jasmine couldn't shake, a feeling of unfinished business. She had exposed Vince, yes, but there was more to do. The people who had been crushed under his rule, the ones who had been manipulated by his lies, deserved justice. And Jasmine, despite the changes in her life, couldn't ignore the call to do more. One evening, as she sat alone in her small apartment, staring at the window that overlooked the city, her phone buzzed. It was a message from the same informant who had helped her gather the files on Vince. The message was simple: "They're still looking for you." Jasmine's heart skipped a beat. She had expected some retaliation, but she hadn't thought it would come this soon. Vince's empire may have crumbled, but the people who were still loyal to him were ruthless. They would stop at nothing to make sure Jasmine couldn't expose the full extent of their operations. She stood up, the weight of the moment sinking in. She wasn't safe. But Jasmine wasn't the type to back down. She had fought her way to this point, and she wasn't going to let fear stop her now. The following day, she went to the only person who could help her navigate the storm ahead: Liam, an old contact from her past. He wasn't part of Vince's world, but he knew how to handle situations like this. Liam was sharp, resourceful, and, most importantly, he understood the stakes. When they met at a coffee shop on the outskirts of the city, Jasmine wasted no time. "I need your help," she said, her voice steady but urgent. Liam looked at her, his expression unreadable, but then he nodded. "I know what you're about to ask. You want to go after them." Jasmine didn't flinch. "I need to finish what I started. I can't let them get away with it." Liam leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he thought. He knew the risks, but he also knew Jasmine. He knew she wasn't going to stop until she had done what needed to be done. "All right," he said finally. "We'll do this, but we do it carefully. We make sure they can't trace it back to us." Over the next few weeks, Jasmine and Liam worked in the shadows, gathering more information, reaching out to people who had been affected by Vince's operations. They exposed his dealings with corrupt officials, his ties to criminal organizations, and the many lives he had ruined in the process. Slowly but surely, the walls around Vince's remaining allies started to close in. They were getting nervous, making mistakes. Jasmine had them exactly where she wanted them. Then, one night, the final piece fell into place. Jasmine received an anonymous tip that would finally break the last of Vince's supporters. A hidden warehouse on the outskirts of the city, where illegal transactions were taking place. It was the perfect opportunity to gather the evidence needed to bring them all down. Jasmine didn't hesitate. She and Liam made their move under the cover of darkness. The night was eerily quiet as they made their way to the warehouse. Jasmine's heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her focus. This was it. She was about to take down the last of Vince's empire. As they entered the warehouse, they moved swiftly, collecting evidence, taking photos, and recording conversations. The people inside had no idea they were being watched. But just as they were about to leave, Jasmine heard a familiar voice. She froze. It was Vince's right-hand man, a man who had been loyal to him for years. Jasmine and Liam quickly hid behind a stack of crates, watching as the man walked past them, talking to someone on the phone. "Yeah, everything's set. We're going to take care of her tonight," he said, his voice cold and calculating. Jasmine's blood ran cold. They were coming for her. This wasn't just about taking down Vince anymore. It was about surviving. With a new urgency, Jasmine signaled to Liam, and they made their way out of the warehouse, careful not to alert anyone. They had the evidence they needed. But now, the real fight was just beginning. Jasmine's heart raced as she and Liam made their way back to the car. The night was closing in, and the weight of their discovery was heavy on her shoulders. She could feel the urgency in every step they took. It was no longer just about revenge, it was about survival. The evidence they had gathered from the warehouse was damning, and they knew it would bring down the last of Vince's supporters. But as they drove through the empty streets, Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The plan had been flawless so far. They had the upper hand, the leverage, but the clock was ticking. It was only a matter of time before Vince's remaining loyalists caught wind of what they were doing. They had to act fast, or all their efforts would be for nothing. As they reached a secluded part of the city, Jasmine's phone buzzed. It was another anonymous tip, this time from a source she hadn't expected to hear from. The message was short and simple. "They know. They're coming for you. Be ready." Jasmine's breath caught in her throat. She knew who they were, the people who had been working for Vince. She could no longer stay hidden in the shadows. Her heart pounded, and for the first time in weeks, she felt the full weight of the danger she was in. This was bigger than just taking down a Mafia boss. This was about staying one step ahead of the very people who would stop at nothing to silence her. She turned to Liam, her face hardening. "We have to get to the safe house," she said, her voice low. Liam didn't hesitate. He floored the accelerator, and they sped through the streets, heading toward the hidden location where Jasmine had stashed the most important pieces of evidence. As they reached the safe house, Jasmine's phone buzzed again. Another message. This time, it was from Liam's phone, sent by someone she didn't recognize. "You're being watched. They know everything." Her blood ran cold. They had been careful, meticulous, but now it felt like everything was slipping through her fingers. They weren't just dealing with Vince anymore. They were up against a network of people who had access to resources that could track them down in seconds. Jasmine's mind raced. She had to think fast. There was no room for mistakes. She couldn't afford to be cornered. The safe house was small, tucked away in a part of town that most people would never venture into, but it wasn't invulnerable. They had to act fast, get the evidence out, and figure out a way to disappear before the news closed in on them. "Liam," Jasmine said, her voice steady despite the storm raging in her mind. "I need you to get the backup files. I'll take care of the rest." Liam nodded, not questioning her for a second. He knew what was at stake. As he moved toward the back of the house, Jasmine sat down at the small desk and opened her laptop. She quickly accessed the encrypted files they had taken from the warehouse. Every piece of evidence they had was stored in these files, proof of Vince's operations, connections, and the dark secrets he had kept hidden. With shaking hands, she started to prepare the files for the next phase. She had to send them out to the right people, expose everything Vince had been hiding, and make sure that his empire couldn't recover. As she worked, the weight of what she was doing settled in. This wasn't just about exposing a criminal. This was about changing the course of the city, about making sure that the people who had suffered under Vince's rule could finally breathe. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for the city's future. Suddenly, she heard a sound outside. A car engine. Then another. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. They were here. She grabbed the backup files, stuffed them into a bag, and moved quickly to the back exit. Her heart was pounding, but she didn't let herself hesitate. They couldn't afford to be caught. As she stepped into the alley behind the house, she saw Liam waiting for her, a look of urgency in his eyes. Without a word, they moved into the shadows, slipping through the narrow streets toward their next destination. They had no time to lose. They couldn't stay at the safe house any longer. Jasmine's mind raced as they ran, thinking about what to do next. They needed to get to a new location, somewhere they could regroup and figure out their next move. But every step they took felt like it brought them closer to being cornered. The streets felt colder now, as if the city itself were closing in on them. Jasmine felt the weight of the files in her bag, and for a moment, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were going to make it through this. But deep down, she knew the battle was far from over. Vince might have been brought to his knees, but his allies were still out there, and they weren't going to give up without a fight. The city was about to change, but Jasmine wasn't sure whether it would be the change she had fought for, or a change that would cost her everything. Jasmine's mind raced as she and Liam moved deeper into the shadows of the alley. The urgency was palpable, every step they took pushing them further away from the safe house and into the unknown. The city had never felt so big, so cold, and Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Her phone buzzed again, and for a moment, she considered ignoring it. But she knew better. There was no room for hesitation. She checked the message. It was from an unknown number. "They know you're moving. Get out of the city." Jasmine's heart skipped a beat. Whoever was sending these messages had eyes everywhere, and she didn't have time to waste. "Liam, we need to go," she said, her voice calm but firm. Liam nodded without a word, already sensing the danger. They had to get out of town, but the question was where. They didn't have much time before Vince's network caught up with them, and Jasmine knew that once they were exposed, there would be no turning back. They reached the car, a sleek black sedan that they had parked on the outskirts of the city for emergencies. As they climbed in, Liam turned the key in the ignition, and the engine roared to life. Jasmine stared out the window as the city faded behind them. It was surreal how quickly everything had changed. Just a few weeks ago, she had been an ordinary waitress, stuck in a cycle of working hard just to survive. Now, she was on the run, trying to bring down one of the most powerful men in the city. But even with the evidence in her possession, Jasmine felt no sense of victory. She had exposed Vince, but his network was far from finished. They still had resources, connections, and people who would stop at nothing to keep their empire intact. As the car sped down the highway, Jasmine's mind kept racing, piecing together the fragments of their plan. They needed a place to lay low, a place where they could regroup and figure out their next move. But where? The safe house had already been compromised, and Jasmine didn't trust anyone who was still loyal to Vince. They had to disappear, at least for a while, until the dust settled. After what felt like hours of driving, Liam finally pulled into a secluded area far outside the city. It was a small cabin, tucked away in the woods, with nothing but trees for miles. Jasmine let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. They unloaded the car and made their way inside. The cabin was sparse, with only the basics: a small kitchen, a couple of chairs, a wood-burning stove. It wasn't luxury, but it was safe. Jasmine set the bag of evidence down on the table and started to go over the files once more. She needed to make sure everything was in order, that nothing had been missed. She had to be thorough, but as she went through the papers, her mind kept returning to the same question: who could they trust? They were running out of allies, and the people who were still out there were growing more desperate. Vince's network was vast, and they had their own ways of making people disappear. Jasmine knew this wasn't just about taking down a single man. This was about taking down an entire system of corruption, and that wouldn't happen overnight. Liam had been quiet, standing by the window, keeping watch. He knew that the real danger was coming. They both did. Jasmine stood up and walked over to him, her eyes scanning the horizon. It was peaceful out here, too quiet even. The calm before the storm. "We have to make sure the evidence gets to the right people," she said, her voice low. Liam turned to her, his face serious. "And we will. But we need to be careful. There are people out there who will kill to protect Vince's empire. We can't be reckless." Jasmine nodded. She knew the stakes, but she couldn't let fear stop her. This was bigger than them. This was about making sure that no one else suffered the way so many people had under Vince's rule. She had to finish what she had started. But even as she made her plans, the weight of the situation pressed down on her. They were vulnerable here, exposed. Every minute they stayed in one place was a risk. Jasmine couldn't afford to stay still for too long. She had to act fast. As the night drew on, the silence in the cabin became overwhelming. The stillness was a stark contrast to the chaos that was unfolding in the city. But Jasmine knew that the real battle was still ahead. Vince's empire might be on the verge of collapse, but his supporters were out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. They wouldn't give up easily. Neither would Jasmine. She wasn't going to stop until she had brought them all down. The city had underestimated her, but she wasn't finished yet. Not by a long shot. The days in the cabin passed slowly. Jasmine and Liam kept to themselves, working in silence, always alert, always waiting for the next move. The weight of their situation was heavy, but Jasmine couldn't afford to dwell on it. She had made it this far. She couldn't stop now. The files they had gathered were crucial, but the next steps were even more critical. Jasmine knew that sending the evidence to the right people was the key to making sure Vince's empire crumbled completely. But the question remained: who could they trust? The people who had helped her along the way were few, and Jasmine didn't want to risk putting them in danger. She had learned the hard way that trust was a fragile thing in this world. As she sat at the table, going over the files once more, her thoughts drifted back to the moment she had first decided to act. When she had been thrown out onto the street by Vince, she had felt humiliated, helpless. But that moment had also awakened something in her. A drive, a purpose. She wasn't going to let him, or anyone like him, ever treat her that way again. She had fought to survive, to get this far. And now, she was going to make sure Vince paid for everything he had done. Jasmine stood up from the table, stretching her arms. The cabin was small, but it was a safe place for now. She walked over to the window and looked out at the woods surrounding them. The silence of the night felt like a lull before the storm. She knew they couldn't stay here for long. Vince's people would be closing in. They would come looking for her soon, and when they did, she had to be ready. Her phone buzzed again, breaking her from her thoughts. She checked the message. It was from the same unknown number. They know. Get out of the cabin now. Jasmine's heart skipped a beat. They had been here too long. They had to leave. She turned to Liam, who was standing by the door, watching her. We need to go, she said, her voice steady but urgent. Liam didn't hesitate. He grabbed the bag with the evidence, and they moved quickly out the back door. Jasmine felt the familiar rush of adrenaline as they ran through the trees, heading toward their next destination. She didn't know where they would go, but she couldn't stay here. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance. Vince's men were close. They had to keep moving. They made their way through the woods, using the cover of darkness to their advantage. Jasmine's mind raced as they moved. She had to think of a way to get the evidence to the right people without getting caught. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. They reached a small, secluded road where Liam had arranged for a car to meet them. As they approached the car, Jasmine looked over her shoulder, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never felt more exposed than she did right now. But there was no turning back. They couldn't afford to be caught. The car sped off into the night, leaving the woods behind. Jasmine sat in the back seat, her eyes scanning the road ahead. They needed to get to a place where they could safely contact their allies. But the longer they stayed on the move, the more dangerous it became. Jasmine's phone buzzed again, and this time it wasn't an anonymous message. It was a call. She answered it without hesitation. Jasmine, a familiar voice said on the other end. It was John, a journalist who had been helping her from the start. I have the information you need. I've contacted some people who can help you take this all the way to the top. But we need to move fast. Vince's people are everywhere. Jasmine's heart sank. She knew that every step they took from here on out would be critical. The stakes had never been higher. I'm on my way, Jasmine said, her voice steady but filled with determination. She turned to Liam. We have to get to John. He has the connections we need to bring this down once and for all. Liam nodded, and they continued their journey through the night. They were getting closer, but Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. She had exposed Vince's secrets, but his reach was vast. They still had a long way to go before they could finally see justice done. But Jasmine wasn't going to stop. Not now. Not when she was so close. Vince had underestimated her once. He wouldn't do it again. The hours passed slowly as Jasmine and Liam drove through the quiet streets. The weight of the situation pressed down on her shoulders, but she knew that the clock was ticking. They were so close, yet so far. Vince's empire might be crumbling, but there was still one last hurdle to overcome. They needed to make sure the evidence reached the right people. Jasmine had trusted the right people before, but now she wasn't so sure. With every passing minute, the world seemed to get smaller, more dangerous. They couldn't afford any mistakes. As the car cruised through the city, Jasmine's thoughts kept drifting back to the night they first met Vince Malone. She had been so sure of herself back then, convinced that she would never let someone like him control her. But things had changed since then. Jasmine had changed. The stakes were higher now, and she wasn't just fighting for her own freedom. She was fighting for everyone who had been oppressed, for everyone who had suffered under Vince's rule. The only way to end this was to see it through to the end, no matter what it took. The car slowed as they neared their destination, an old building in a quiet part of the city. Jasmine felt a lump form in her throat. This was it. She was about to meet with the people who could help her take down the rest of Vince's network. But there was a nagging doubt in her mind. Could she trust them? They were running out of options, and Jasmine knew that she couldn't afford to be wrong. The building was dark, its windows blacked out. Jasmine's nerves were on edge as they pulled up to the curb. She glanced at Liam, who seemed just as tense. This is it, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Liam nodded, his eyes hard. We've come this far. Let's finish it. They stepped out of the car and made their way to the building's entrance. As they walked, the sound of their footsteps echoed in the empty streets. Jasmine's heart was racing, but she kept her focus. They had no time to waste. The door creaked open, and they stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of dust and old wood. The room was dimly lit, but Jasmine could see figures moving in the shadows. She couldn't make out their faces, but she could feel the weight of their eyes on her. Jasmine, a voice called from the back of the room. It was John, the journalist who had been helping her from the beginning. He was standing near a desk, papers spread out in front of him. He looked up as they approached. You made it, he said, his voice steady. Jasmine didn't hesitate. She walked toward him, her eyes scanning the room. There were a few others standing around, but they didn't look like the type to be easily trusted. She couldn't afford to take any chances. "We need to get this evidence into the right hands," she said, her voice low but firm. "We're running out of time." John nodded, his expression serious. "I've already made the necessary calls. We're close, but we need to be careful. Vince's people are still out there, and they're getting more desperate." Jasmine felt a surge of determination. She wasn't about to let anyone stop her now. "We've got what we need. We just have to make sure it gets to the right people." As they went over the details of their plan, Jasmine felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. She had been so consumed by fear and uncertainty, but now, standing in that room, it felt like everything was finally falling into place. The pieces were aligning, and the end was within reach. But even as she felt a flicker of hope, she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in the pit of her stomach. She knew better than to trust anyone completely. Vince's empire was vast, and there were still people loyal to him, people who wouldn't hesitate to do whatever it took to protect their interests. They couldn't let their guard down, not now. As they prepared to send the evidence to the authorities, Jasmine couldn't help but think of the road that had led her here. From the moment Vince had thrown her onto the street, she had known that her life would never be the same. But she had never imagined that it would lead to this, that she would be standing here, at the center of something so much bigger than herself. The journey had been long, and the price had been steep. But in the end, it had been worth it. Jasmine knew that she had done what she had set out to do. She had exposed the truth, and now it was up to others to carry it forward. She wasn't done yet, but the hardest part was over. As they left the building and stepped back into the night, Jasmine couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. The fight wasn't over, but she had won the most important battle. Vince's empire had been shaken to its core, and Jasmine had played a key role in bringing it down. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about justice, and Jasmine had finally found the courage to claim it. The following days were filled with tension. Jasmine knew the hardest part was yet to come, and despite her success in getting the evidence into the right hands, she couldn't relax. Vince Malone's empire had taken a serious blow, but Jasmine wasn't foolish enough to think it was over. The authorities had the files, yes, but his influence still ran deep, and the people loyal to him weren't about to let him fall without a fight. As she sat in the small room, surrounded by the quiet hum of the city outside, she found it hard to sit still. The weight of everything she had fought for, the risks, the sacrifices, were all converging on this one moment. She had done what she had set out to do. She had exposed Vince's darkest secrets, but now she had to make sure the truth was heard. Every phone call she made, every step she took, was a move in a larger game, one she couldn't afford to lose. She glanced at her phone, checking for any updates. There were none. The silence was deafening, and with it came the anxiety of waiting. Jasmine hated waiting. She had never been one to sit idly by while things unfolded. She had always preferred to take matters into her own hands, even when the risks were high. The few people she had trusted along the way, John, Liam, and even her anonymous sources, had done their part. But now, it was time for Jasmine to step into the light. She couldn't stay hidden in the shadows forever. The world needed to know the truth. As the hours passed, Jasmine's thoughts shifted. She remembered the first time she had crossed paths with Vince Malone. She had been just another face in the crowd, another working-class woman who had learned to keep her head down. But then he had thrown her out onto the street. That was the moment everything changed. That was when she realized that she couldn't just survive. She had to fight. Vince hadn't known what hit him. He had underestimated her, thinking that someone like her would be easy to crush. But Jasmine had surprised him, and now, she would make sure he would never forget who she was. She stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the city skyline. It had been her home for so long, but now it felt like a stranger. The familiar streets, the bustling crowd, it all seemed so distant now. She had crossed a line, and she knew she could never go back to the life she had before. The phone buzzed again, breaking her from her thoughts. It was a message. From Liam. They're making their move. It's time. Jasmine's heart skipped a beat. She had been expecting this, but now that the moment was here, it felt real. She quickly grabbed her bag, stuffed the last of the important files inside, and made her way to the door. "I'm ready," she muttered to herself, her voice steady but filled with determination. She had come too far to turn back now. As she stepped out into the night, the weight of the world seemed to lift off her shoulders. The darkness of the city streets embraced her as she walked, each step carrying her closer to the final chapter of this battle. She wasn't just a woman out for revenge. She was a force, a woman who had fought for what was right, no matter the cost. Jasmine climbed into the car waiting for her, and as they drove toward the final location, she couldn't help but feel a sense of calm settle over her. This was it. This was the moment she had been waiting for. As they reached the rendezvous point, the city lights flickering in the distance, Jasmine knew that her actions would change everything. She had already exposed Vince's secrets, but this was about more than that. This was about making sure that his empire would never rise again. She had taken everything from him. Now, it was time to take back the power. They arrived at the location, a large, nondescript building on the edge of the city. Jasmine could feel the tension in the air as she stepped out of the car, her steps sure and unwavering. This was where it would all come to a head. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let Vince win. Not now. Not ever. As she entered the building, she was greeted by John, who was standing by the door. His face was serious, but there was a glint of recognition in his eyes. "You made it," he said, his voice calm but urgent. Jasmine nodded. It's time to finish this. She could feel the weight of the moment. This was the final step, the last piece of the puzzle. And when the dust settled, Vince Malone's name would be nothing but a memory. They walked through the building, each step bringing them closer to the final confrontation. Jasmine's mind was sharp, focused. She could hear her heart pounding in her chest, but she didn't let it distract her. She had come too far to let fear stop her now. This was her time to finish what she had started. The atmosphere inside the building was thick with tension. As Jasmine walked alongside John, her mind was laser-focused on what needed to happen next. This was the culmination of everything she had fought for, everything she had sacrificed. The walls seemed to close in around her as they moved down a long, dimly lit corridor. Each step felt like a drumbeat in her chest, reverberating through the silence. Liam had already gone ahead, ensuring that the remaining obstacles were cleared. This was it. The final confrontation. No more hiding, no more running. Jasmine was ready to finish what she had started. As they reached the door at the end of the hallway, John gave her a quick glance. "You sure about this?" he asked, his voice steady but with an edge of concern. Jasmine didn't hesitate. "I've come this far. It's time to end it." John nodded, and with a deep breath, he pushed the door open. The room was eerily quiet, the only sound the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Jasmine's eyes immediately went to the center of the room, where a man stood with his back to them. He was tall, imposing, with a suit that looked like it had been tailored by the best. But Jasmine wasn't fooled by appearances. She knew who he was. And now, she was finally face to face with him. "Vince," Jasmine said, her voice calm, but full of authority. He turned slowly, his face a mask of surprise, quickly replaced by a cold, calculating expression. "You," he spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think you can bring me down?" Jasmine didn't flinch. "I know I can." Vince took a step toward her, his gaze flicking to John before returning to Jasmine. "You've been a thorn in my side for too long. You're nothing but a pawn in this game." Jasmine shook her head. "Not anymore. I'm the one who's calling the shots now." Vince's lips curled into a twisted smile. "You think exposing me will change anything? You think you've won?" Jasmine met his gaze, unflinching. "It's not just about exposing you. It's about taking everything you built and tearing it down, one brick at a time." Vince's smile faltered for a split second, and in that moment, Jasmine knew she had him. He wasn't as confident as he appeared. He was vulnerable. The empire he had spent years building was crumbling, and he knew it. Jasmine stepped forward, her voice low but filled with purpose. "I've got everything, Vince. The files, the recordings, everything. You're finished." Vince's eyes narrowed, his posture stiffening. "You think the people who work for me will let you get away with this? You think they'll just hand over everything to you? You have no idea what you're up against." Jasmine took another step forward, her expression unwavering. "You've underestimated me from the beginning. But now, you'll see just how far I'm willing to go." For a moment, there was silence between them. The weight of their confrontation hung heavy in the air, the tension thick enough to cut through. But Jasmine didn't back down. She wasn't afraid. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to stop now. "The only thing left for you to do," she said, "is accept that you lost. Your empire is falling apart, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. Vince didn't respond at first. His eyes darted between Jasmine and John, the realization slowly sinking in that his grip on the city was slipping. You think you've won, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but you're wrong. This isn't over. It'll never be over. Jasmine tilted her head slightly, her gaze sharp. It is over, Vince. And you're not going to get another chance to destroy people's lives. Not on my watch. The air in the room seemed to grow even heavier as Vince's expression shifted from anger to something that almost resembled defeat. Jasmine knew that he wasn't going to go down without a fight, but she had already won. The pieces were in place, and Vince's empire was crumbling around him. There was nothing he could do now to stop the tide. As Jasmine stood there, facing the man who had once held all the power, she felt a surge of relief. This was the moment she had been working for, the moment when she could finally look at Vince Malone and know that he had lost. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice, and Jasmine had made sure that justice would be served. You can try to fight it, she said, her voice steady. But it's over, and you know it. Vince said nothing in response. His silence spoke volumes, and in that silence, Jasmine found the closure she had been seeking. The battle was won, and Vince Malone's reign was finally over. The days following the confrontation with Vince Malone felt surreal to Jasmine. She had taken down the man who had once controlled everything in the city, but now, as the weight of her success settled on her shoulders, she was left wondering what came next. She had expected to feel relief, but instead, there was an overwhelming sense of uncertainty. Vince's empire had crumbled, but the fallout was far from over. The people who had been loyal to him, the ones who still believed in his vision, were not going to let his downfall go unchallenged. Jasmine knew this. She had known all along that tearing down an empire was never as simple as exposing its secrets. It was about making sure those secrets didn't get buried in the rubble. As she sat in the small apartment she had been staying in, her mind raced with thoughts of what she had to do next. There was still work to be done. The information they had gathered, those crucial files, the recordings, everything, needed to be distributed to the right people. She couldn't afford to let anyone, especially Vince's remaining allies, silence her. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from John. They're trying to cover it up. You need to act fast. Jasmine's heart sank. She had feared this moment would come. It was always going to be this way. No matter how much damage Vince had taken, his supporters were relentless. She stood up, her pulse quickening. There was no more waiting. This was the final step. The information had to be out there. No more hiding. No more second-guessing. She had to make sure Vince's empire, the one built on fear and lies, stayed broken. Jasmine quickly gathered the files, making sure everything was in order. She didn't need to double-check. She had done this countless times. The evidence was solid. It had to be. She had worked too hard for this moment. And now, the world needed to know the truth. She grabbed her bag and stepped out into the night, her mind already planning her next move. The city was quiet, too quiet. The streetlights cast long shadows as she walked, and with each step, the weight of the world seemed to press down on her a little more. Jasmine didn't mind the pressure. It had been with her since that night Vince had thrown her into the street. The difference now was that she wasn't afraid. She was the one holding all the cards. As she reached the car, Liam was waiting for her. His face was as tense as ever, but his eyes showed something else now, determination. "We're ready," he said, his voice steady. Jasmine nodded and slid into the car. "Let's get this done." They drove through the city streets in silence, both of them fully aware of the stakes. The plan had been set in motion, but there was still a chance it could all fall apart. The people who had been loyal to Vince would do anything to protect what they had left. But Jasmine had already taken down the head of the snake. Now, it was time to finish the job. They reached the location, a secure server station where they could upload the files to the proper channels. Jasmine and Liam moved quickly, their steps efficient, purposeful. As they entered the building, the security was tighter than expected. But Jasmine wasn't afraid. They had planned for this. They had prepared for every possibility. They bypassed the first layer of security with ease, making their way to the server room. Jasmine's heart raced as she approached the terminal. This was it, the moment she had been working toward for so long. She plugged the USB drive into the system and began uploading the files. As the data transferred, Jasmine stood by, watching the progress bar fill. She couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction as the evidence was uploaded to the network. There would be no way to erase it now. The truth was out. But just as the upload completed, Jasmine's phone buzzed again. She checked it quickly, her stomach dropping. It was another message. They know you're here. Get out. Jasmine's eyes went wide. The trap had been set. They had to move fast. Liam, we're out of time, she said, her voice sharp. Without a second thought, they grabbed their things and rushed for the exit. As they ran through the building, Jasmine's mind raced. She couldn't let them get caught now. They had come so far. They had to make it out. They reached the back exit and ducked into the alley, the sound of footsteps echoing in the hallway behind them. Jasmine's breath quickened, but she didn't slow down. They had to get to the car, and fast. As they ran down the alley, the car appeared in the distance, just where they had left it. The engine was running, waiting for them. Liam got in first, followed by Jasmine. The car sped off, leaving the building behind. Jasmine leaned back in her seat, her heart still racing. She had done it. She had exposed Vince's empire. And now, with the evidence safely in the right hands, there was no going back. It was over. For Vince. For his supporters. For the people who had been crushed under his control. Jasmine had won. And she would make sure that the world would never forget it. The days that followed were a blur of activity. But Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. The weight of everything she had fought for pressed heavily on her shoulders. She had exposed Vince's empire, seen it crumble before her eyes. But there was a lingering uncertainty that kept gnawing at her. The files were out there now, the evidence was in the right hands, and the authorities were beginning their investigations. But Jasmine knew that the people who had been loyal to Vince wouldn't just disappear quietly. His network, though fractured, still had its reach. She couldn't trust that the fight was truly over. As she sat in her small apartment, staring out at the city below, Jasmine's phone buzzed. It was a message from Liam. They're not backing down. They're making their move. Her stomach churned. The people who had once feared Vince were now coming out of the shadows, trying to salvage what was left of his crumbling empire. They weren't done yet, and neither was Jasmine. She stood up and paced the small room, the gravity of the situation settling on her. Vince's empire might have been shattered, but the people who had worked for him, the ones who had gained power from his manipulation, would stop at nothing to protect their interests. Jasmine had already exposed so much, but she knew there was more to uncover. The pieces were still in motion, and it wasn't over until the last one fell into place. She had to finish what she had started. There was no turning back now. As she grabbed her bag and prepared to leave, Jasmine's mind raced. What was their next move? She had already sent the files to the authorities, but she needed to make sure they stayed safe. She needed to ensure that no one could erase what she had uncovered. The truth had to be out there. It was the only way to make sure Vince's legacy of fear didn't live on. Liam was waiting for her outside, his face set in that familiar expression of determination. There was no more room for doubt. They had come this far, and now it was time to finish the job. Together, they got in the car and drove through the city, heading toward a new location. Jasmine's mind was sharp, focused on the next steps. She had to stay ahead of Vince's remaining loyalists, make sure they didn't find her or anyone who had helped her. As they neared their destination, Jasmine's phone buzzed again. It was a message from an anonymous number. You're being watched. You're running out of time. She felt the familiar rush of adrenaline flood her veins, but she didn't let it slow her down. This was the fight she had been preparing for. She couldn't afford to be caught now. They arrived at a nondescript building, one that blended in with the surrounding structures. It looked harmless enough, but Jasmine knew better. This was where they would make their final move. As they entered, the air felt heavy with tension. Jasmine could feel the weight of everything that had led her to this moment. The room was dimly lit, filled with people who had come to help her, journalists, insiders, and others who had been working behind the scenes to bring down Vince's empire. Jasmine's eyes scanned the room, taking in every face. She didn't trust anyone completely, but she knew that the time had come to put her faith in the right people. They had already done so much, but this was the moment that would decide everything. We're ready, Liam said, his voice calm but firm. Jasmine nodded, her determination unwavering. This was it. The truth had to be set in motion. They couldn't afford to wait any longer. Jasmine stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. As she looked around the room, she realized that she had made it this far, because she refused to give up. No one else had the courage to stand up against Vince, but she had. And now, they were on the brink of finishing what she had started. She wasn't doing this for herself anymore. She was doing it for everyone who had suffered under Vince's rule, for the people who had been crushed under his empire of fear. This was about justice, and Jasmine was going to make sure it was served. The team worked quickly, the final steps of their plan falling into place. Jasmine's hands were steady as she oversaw the process. This was her moment of triumph, but she couldn't let herself get distracted. There was still work to be done. The files were being sent out, the information was being shared, and soon, Vince's name would be tarnished beyond repair. He would never be able to hide from the truth again. As Jasmine watched everything unfold, she felt a surge of pride. She had done it. The pieces were all falling into place. But even as she allowed herself a moment of relief, she knew that she couldn't let her guard down. The battle had been hard fought, and there was still a chance that someone would try to pick up the pieces of Vince's empire. But Jasmine wasn't worried. She had already exposed the truth. Vince was finished, and nothing would ever be the same again. Jasmine sat in the car, the familiar hum of the engine filling the silence as Liam drove them toward their next destination. The weight of everything they had accomplished hung heavily in the air, but Jasmine knew that this wasn't the time for relief. Not yet. They had exposed Vince Malone, and his empire had begun to fall apart, but there were still lingering threats. The people who had been loyal to him were not just going to disappear. They were dangerous, and Jasmine knew that she couldn't rest until she had completely dismantled the network that had fueled Vince's power for so long. The city passed by in a blur, the familiar streets now feeling like foreign territory. Jasmine felt a sense of detachment, as though she was watching everything unfold from a distance. It was strange. She had worked so hard to get here, to bring down someone like Vince, but now that it was happening, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to do. They arrived at a small, nondescript building on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't much to look at, but Jasmine knew it was exactly where they needed to be. This was the last step, the final phase of their plan. As they stepped out of the car and walked toward the building, Jasmine's heart raced. She couldn't afford to get distracted now. This was the moment she had been working toward. She had to make sure the evidence they had gathered was shared with the right people, with those who would make sure it couldn't be buried. Inside the building, the team was already waiting. Jasmine exchanged brief nods with each of them, a silent acknowledgement of the work they had done together. There was no need for words now. They all understood the stakes. Jasmine took a seat at the small table in the center of the room, her eyes scanning the faces around her. They were all here for one reason: to make sure that Vince's empire, and the people who had supported it, would never rise again. The air in the room was thick with anticipation. As Jasmine looked around, she realized that this was the moment of truth. They had already exposed Vince's darkest secrets, but the real challenge was making sure those secrets were never forgotten. She couldn't let anyone silence the truth now. John, the journalist who had helped them from the beginning, stood up and addressed the group. "We've got the files. The truth is out there. Now we need to make sure it doesn't disappear." Jasmine nodded. "I'll handle the distribution. It's time to make sure the world sees what we've uncovered." She stood up and walked to the table, where the files were laid out. As she carefully packed them into a secure case, her mind raced with possibilities. This wasn't just about exposing one man. This was about taking down a system of corruption that had thrived for too long. She was ready for it. As Jasmine prepared to leave the room, she felt a moment of peace. The work wasn't finished, but the hardest part was over. She had done what she set out to do. She had exposed Vince's empire, and she had done it with conviction. But even as she stepped out into the night, a part of her knew that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. There would always be others, people who would rise to take Vince's place. But Jasmine was ready for whatever came next. As she walked through the quiet streets, the weight of the city's skyline pressing down on her, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. She had taken down one of the most powerful men in the city. She had done it with nothing but her determination and her will to fight for what was right. And she had succeeded. There would be more battles ahead, but Jasmine was no longer afraid. The fight had made her stronger. And now, more than ever, she was ready to take on whatever came next. The city had a different feel now. Jasmine had done what she set out to do. She had brought down Vince Malone, and his empire was in ruins. But as she walked through the familiar streets, The weight of her success still didn't feel real. She had fought for justice, for the truth, but now, as she looked around, she realized that the city was still the same. The people, the streets, the buildings, they hadn't changed. She had changed, though. She was no longer just a woman trying to survive. She had become someone who fought for what was right, someone who wasn't afraid to stand up to the powerful. Jasmine didn't know what came next. She had won the battle, but the war was never truly over. There would always be another challenge, another person to expose, another system of corruption to tear down. But she was ready for it. She had learned a lot over the past few months. She had learned how to fight, how to stay calm under pressure, how to trust her instincts. Most of all, she had learned that nothing worth fighting for came easily. The hard work, the sleepless nights, the moments of doubt, all of it had led her here. And now, as she walked down the street, she realized that she had a choice. She could keep fighting, keep working to bring down the corrupt systems that plagued the city. Or she could walk away, live a quiet life, and let someone else take up the fight. Jasmine didn't know if she was ready for that yet. She had given everything for this moment, and she wasn't sure she could walk away from it now. She walked into her apartment, the door creaking behind her as she entered. The familiar surroundings, the small kitchen, the worn-out couch, it all felt so distant now. She had spent so many nights in this place, trying to figure out what her next move would be. And now, for the first time, she felt a sense of peace. She had done it. She had exposed the truth, taken down one of the most powerful men in the city, and made sure that the world would never forget it. But the road ahead was still uncertain. Jasmine couldn't help but wonder what it would take to finally make a difference in this city. What would it take to truly change things, to ensure that the corruption, the fear, the manipulation would never rise again? She didn't have the answers, but she knew one thing for sure: she wouldn't stop fighting. Not now. Not ever. As she sat down on the couch, Jasmine took a deep breath, allowing herself a moment to relax. She had worked so hard to get here, and now, for the first time in a long time, she could breathe. The battle was far from over, but she had made her mark, and she was ready for whatever came next. With a renewed sense of determination, Jasmine stood up and walked to the window. The city stretched out before her, the lights flickering in the distance. It was beautiful in its own way, and for the first time, Jasmine felt like she belonged here. She had taken down the empire, and now she was free. But freedom came with a price. She had given everything for it. But in the end, it had been worth it. The city was changing, one step at a time. And Jasmine would be there, ready to lead the charge whenever the next battle came.